The wedding planner had color-coded everything. Ivory place cards, 1,200 white orchids flown in from Jeju, a string quartet warming up behind a wall of frosted glass. Nobody in that ballroom in Seoul was expecting a woman in gold. I walked in through the east doors at 4:47 in the afternoon, 11 minutes before the ceremony was supposed to begin, and I felt the room turn the way a held breath turns into something you can't take back. Heads swiveled first, then whispers, then a silence with actual weight to it, the kind that presses against your ribs. I found him easily. He was standing at the altar in a black tuxedo he did not choose for himself. I recognized the tailor's hand from 15 years of watching him get dressed. When his eyes found mine across 400 guests, I watched the color leave his face in real time. Beside him, in a gown that cost more than most people's houses, So-min turned to see what had stolen her groom's attention. I watched her recognize me too. I watched her remember exactly who I was, and exactly what I might be holding in the small gold clutch pressed against my hip. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I walked down that aisle in slow, unhurried steps, past faces that used to call me family, until I stood close enough to see the tremor start in Woo-jin's jaw. "You're not on the list," someone hissed behind me. I didn't turn around. "I don't need to be," I said. "I own the building." That's the part people will talk about for years. Not what I said next, not what happened after, but those first 60 seconds when an entire wedding held its breath and nobody, not the groom, not the bride, not the mother standing rigid in the front row, knew whether I had come to destroy the day or simply to watch it destroy itself. By the time those doors closed behind me 2 hours later, the marriage of Woo-jin and So-min had already ended. They just didn't know it yet. But if you want to understand how a woman ends up standing in the doorway of her ex-husband's wedding, wearing gold and holding the deed to the very room he's standing in, you have to go back. 15 years back, to a rooftop in Incheon, and a boy who used to be kind before he learned how to be powerful. Before I take you there, I need you to do something for me. If you've ever loved someone so completely that you stopped keeping track of what you were owed in return, stay with me to the end of this one. Hit subscribe now, because in a few minutes you're going to understand exactly why I couldn't just walk away quietly. I had to walk back in. My name is Anaya Winslow. I was 23 the year I met Woo-jin, standing on the roof of a half-finished apartment block in Incheon with a set of blueprints under my arm, and absolutely no idea that the quiet young man watching the sunset from the scaffolding would become my husband, or that 15 years later I would be the one deciding whether his family's empire lived or died. I was an architecture intern that summer, on loan from a small firm in Atlanta to a joint venture rebuilding a stretch of the old harbor district. He wasn't supposed to be there either. He told me later that he used to climb up to that unfinished roof most evenings just to get away from his father's office, from the ledgers and the men in dark suits who never quite looked him in the eye. He said I was the first person in months who talked to him like he was a person and not an heir. We didn't fall in love the way movies tell you to expect. It was slower than that, and stranger. It was him showing up with coffee at 6 in the morning because he'd noticed I forgot to eat when I was working. It was me correcting his English idioms and him correcting my Hangul, both of us laughing too hard at how bad we were at it. It was 6 months of stolen hours before either of us said anything about how we felt, because we both already understood what his family would say about a match like ours. I remember the exact evening it tipped over into something neither of us could pretend was just friendship. We were sitting on the edge of that unfinished roof, legs hanging over 11 stories of open air, and a sudden summer storm rolled in off the water faster than either of us expected. We got soaked before we even made it to the stairwell, laughing so hard I couldn't breathe. And when we finally stopped under the shelter of a half-built doorway, dripping, he looked at me the way you look at something you've decided, in one single unguarded second, that you cannot live without. "My family will hate this," he said. Not as a warning, but almost like a confession. "I know," I told him. "I don't care," he said, and I believed him completely, because in that moment, soaked and laughing under a doorway that didn't even have a door yet, I don't think he was lying. I don't think either of us knew yet how expensive that kind of not caring would eventually become. If you're watching this, and you've ever had someone choose you against everyone who told them not to, you already know how that feels. It feels like being chosen twice. Once by the person, and once by their courage. I didn't know yet that courage, like everything else in that family, could be spent down to nothing. The wedding was small, almost apologetic, held at a countryside inn 2 hours outside Seoul because his mother refused to attend anything grander. I wore my own grandmother's pearl earrings instead of the Gu family jewelry Madame Han pointedly never offered me. Woo-jin's father, Gu Sang-chul, was the only member of his family who cried, and afterward he took my hands in both of his and told me, in careful, halting English he'd clearly practiced, "You are the first honest thing that has happened to this family in a long time. Do not let them make you dishonest too." I didn't understand what he meant then. I understood it 15 years later, standing in a warehouse with a set of keys in my palm, remembering the exact weight of his hands. The first 5 years were the good ones, if I'm being honest with you, the way I promised I would be. Woo-jin was still learning the business his father ran, a shipping and logistics empire with roots that went back 3 generations and branches that, if you asked certain people in certain rooms, reached into places far darker than any import manifest would show. I was building a career of my own, slowly, quietly, sketching the outline of the design studio I dreamed of one day running myself. We had a small apartment in Incheon before we had a mansion in Seoul, and I think back on those years the way you think back on the last good summer before everything changed. We didn't know we were living inside the good years while we were living inside them. Nobody ever does. Then Gu Sang-chul died, suddenly, of a heart that had carried too much weight for too long. And Woo-jin became chairman of Gu Group at 31 years old, and something in him closed like a door I hadn't realized was still open. I want to be fair to him here, because even now, after everything, I don't think he became cruel on purpose. Power in that family didn't ask permission. It simply arrived, and you either learned to wear it or it wore you. Woo-jin worked 18-hour days. He started flinching at phone calls the way his father used to. He started disappearing into a version of himself that had no room left over for a wife who used to make him laugh on unfinished rooftops. I stayed. I want you to understand that clearly, because everything that happened later only makes sense if you understand how completely I stayed. I put my own studio on hold. I learned to run a household with 40 staff in it. I learned which board members to charm and which ones to avoid, which journalists could be trusted with an off-record comment, and which ones would twist it into a headline by morning. I became, without ever asking to be, one of the quiet architectures holding up Gu Group from the inside, the kind of support nobody puts on an organizational chart because nobody thinks to. Madame Han never softened. If anything, she sharpened, the way certain things do with time instead of dulling. Every family gathering became a small performance of exactly how much I did not belong, delivered in comments so precisely worded I couldn't repeat them to anyone without sounding paranoid. "You've done remarkably well, considering," she told me once, at a dinner honoring Woo-jin's 10th year as chairman, in front of 11 guests who all pretended not to hear it. Considering what, she never finished, and never needed to. 10 years in, I stopped waiting for her to accept me, and started simply enduring her, which I now understand was its own kind of exhaustion. The kind that doesn't announce itself until you're already hollowed out by it. There's a particular memory from that decade I want to give you, because I didn't understand its weight until years later. It was Woo-jin's father's 65th birthday, the last one he'd lived to see, and the whole extended Gu family had gathered at the countryside estate for the kind of formal dinner where every seat is assigned and every silence is measured. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had drifted onto the terrace, Gu Sang-chul pulled me aside near the koi pond and told me, quietly, that he'd watched me hold that family together for a decade without a single person in it ever thanking me for it. "They will not say it," he told me, in that careful English he saved for the things he wanted me to remember exactly. So I will say it instead. Thank you for staying, even when staying costs you something every day. I didn't know, standing by that pond, that he was already thinking about Pier Six, already deciding what he wanted to do about a debt he felt his family could never properly repay in words. I only knew that it was the first time in 10 years anyone in that house had looked at what I carried and called it by its true name. That was the year So-min walked into our lives, hired as a public relations consultant for a merger Gu Group was negotiating with her father's company, Yo Holdings, one of the only conglomerates in the country large enough to matter to a family like mine. She was 28, brilliant in the specific way that makes people forgive almost anything. And she looked at Woo-jin the first time I watched them in a room together the way I used to look at him on that Incheon rooftop. I noticed it before he did. Women always notice it before the men do. I told myself it was nothing for 8 months. I want to be honest about that too, because there's no version of this story where I'm the woman who saw it coming and did nothing. I saw it coming, and I did everything I knew how to do. I asked him if the late nights bothered him. I asked if I should come to more of the merger dinners. I asked, gently, more than once, if there was anything he needed from me that he wasn't getting. Every time, he told me I was imagining things, and every time, I believed him a little less, and every time, I stayed anyway. Because 15 years of loving someone teaches you a particular, dangerous kind of patience. If you're watching this and you've ever caught yourself explaining away the thing you already knew, comment the word "I know" below, because I think there are more of us than we admit. The gala, where everyone else finally saw what I had been seeing alone, happened on a Saturday in April, at the Grand Hyatt in Seoul, to celebrate the formal signing of the Guyo merger. 400 guests. Every board member from both companies. Half the business press in the country. Madame Han stood at the podium that night and, in the middle of a toast about legacy and partnership, said something no one in that room could have missed. She raised her glass towards So-min, seated 2 tables away in crimson silk, and said, "Tonight we welcome a young woman this family should have found years ago." She did not look at me once while she said it. She did not need to. Every camera in the room found my face anyway, and I sat there in front of 400 people and a dozen photographers, holding a smile that had taken me 15 years to learn how to hold under fire, while my mother-in-law publicly erased me in front of my own husband, who said nothing, who looked at his wine glass instead of at me, who let the silence answer for him. If you're watching this from a city where you've ever had to smile through a room that was quietly deciding you didn't belong in it anymore, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this feeling actually travels, because that night, sitting in that ballroom, I felt further from home than I had ever felt in my life, and I was surrounded by 400 people who all knew my name. Before I confronted him, I made one mistake I still think about, which was trying to talk to So-min directly. I found her alone near the coat check, and I asked her, as plainly as I'd asked Woo-jin, whether there was something happening between them that I deserved to know about. She looked at me for a long moment, and instead of denying it the way I half expected, she simply smiled, small and precise, and said, "You've given this family 15 years, Mrs. Gu. I think everyone in that ballroom just watched you find out exactly how much that's worth to them." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't quite an insult either. It was worse than both, because it was true, and because she said it with the calm confidence of someone who had already done the math on my marriage and decided the sum didn't add up to much. I walked away from that coat check with my hands shaking, and it took me until the car, until I was alone with Woo-jin and the privacy of closed doors, before I let myself ask him the question I'd been carrying since that toast. I confronted Woo-jin in the car on the way home. Not with tears, because I had trained myself out of tears in front of him years earlier, but with a directness I hadn't used with him since we were 23. I asked him plainly if he was sleeping with her. He said no. I asked him plainly if he was in love with her. He was quiet for 4 full seconds before he said no again, and I have thought about those 4 seconds nearly every day since, because a real no doesn't need 4 seconds to find itself. 3 weeks later, I found the hotel receipt myself, tucked into a jacket he'd forgotten to have cleaned, dated the same week as a business trip to Busan he had told me was solo. It was such a small, ordinary piece of paper to end 15 years over. I remember standing in our closet holding it, staring at the printed date, waiting to feel something enormous, and instead feeling almost nothing at all. Just a strange, quiet clarity, the way a room looks different once you finally turn all the lights on in it. I didn't confront him with it right away. I sat with it for 2 days, turning it over, trying to decide whether the woman I had built a life around 15 years earlier was still somewhere inside the man who had stopped being able to look at me during toasts. I remember going through our wedding photos those 2 nights, searching his face in each one for the exact moment he started disappearing, and never quite finding it, because that's not how it happens. Nobody vanishes all at once. They erode, one small silence at a time, until one day you're holding a hotel receipt and realizing the person you married left so gradually you never even heard the door. When I finally asked him, standing in the kitchen of the house we'd lived in for 8 years, he didn't deny it the way he'd denied it in the car. He just looked tired, the way people look when a lie has finally cost more than the truth would have. "It isn't what you think," he said, which is what every person says right before it turns out to be exactly what you think. He told me the merger with Yo Holdings was worth more to the company's survival than I understood, that his mother had made it clear the alliance would be far more secure sealed by marriage than by contract, that So-min's father, Yo Dong-hyun, had all but said the same thing in a private meeting Woo-jin hadn't told me about until that moment. He told me none of it had started as feelings. He told me feelings had simply arrived somewhere in the middle of doing what the family needed, the way power always seemed to arrive in that family without asking permission. I asked him one question. I asked him if he was going to end it. He didn't answer. 15 years of marriage, and the silence after that question was the loudest thing I had ever heard him say. I left that night. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything, though I want you to know I thought about it. I packed one bag, took the car I had bought with my own savings years before any of this started, and drove to a hotel in the city. And I sat on the edge of that hotel bed at 2 in the morning, and I finally let myself cry. Quietly, for the first time in longer than I could remember, not because my marriage had ended, but because some small, stubborn part of me had genuinely believed it wouldn't. If you've ever asked someone a direct question and understood everything you needed to know from how long they took to answer it, you already know exactly what that silence sounded like. Comment the word enough below if you've ever realized, in one single moment, that you had already given someone more than enough chances. I want to tell you something now that I didn't understand myself until much later. Something that happened 7 years before that night in the kitchen. A memory I had filed away as sentimental and nothing more, until it turned out to be the single most important thing anyone in that family ever gave me. It was the year a rival shipping conglomerate tried to force a hostile takeover of Gu Group, back when Gu Sang-chul was still alive and still chairman. Back when the family's fortunes were far more fragile than the polished version everyone saw from the outside. I was the one who found the irregularity, buried in a shipment manifest I'd been helping proofread for a translation, a discrepancy that turned out to be the first thread in unraveling the rival company's plan to buy out 3 of Gu Group's smallest shareholders and use their combined stake as leverage. I brought it to Sang-chul myself, at 6 in the morning, before Woo-jin was even awake, because I didn't trust anyone else in that house not to bury it for their own reasons. He never forgot it. 2 months later, quietly, without telling his son, without telling his wife, Gu Sang-chul had his lawyer draw up a private transfer, and he signed over to me, personally, in my name alone, the deed to a small waterfront property in Incheon that most of the family considered worthless. Pier Six, an old brick warehouse where the very first Gu shipping office had operated 70 years earlier, before the company owned a single skyscraper, before anyone in that family had learned what it meant to want more than survival. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was an odd thing to give someone as a thank you, a crumbling building nobody wanted. And I remember him watching my face carefully as I unfolded the deed, as if he were waiting to see whether I would understand what he was actually telling me. I didn't. Not then. I thanked him the way you thank someone for a kind but slightly strange gesture, and I put the paperwork in a drawer, and I went back to being a daughter-in-law nobody in that house considered suitable. It would be 7 more years before I understood that Gu Sang-chul hadn't been sentimental at all. He had been careful, in the quiet, deliberate way powerful men are careful when they've learned the hard way that empires need more than one honest person holding a key. "This is not much," he told me, pressing the key into my palm with both of his hands, the way he had at my wedding. "But it is the beginning of everything they have. And it should belong to someone who understands what an honest beginning is worth." I put that key in a drawer and mostly forgot about it for years. I thought it was sentiment. I thought it was an old man being sweet to a daughter-in-law he'd grown fond of. I did not understand, until much later, that Pier Six sat on the exact stretch of Incheon waterfront that Yo Holdings needed desperately, to complete the redevelopment project that was the actual, unspoken backbone of the entire Gu-Yo merger. Every projection Yeo Dong-hyun had built his company's next decade around depended on consolidating that stretch of harbour, parcel by parcel, and there was exactly one parcel in the middle of it that Gu Group did not, and never had, owned. Gu Sang-chul had known that when he signed it over to me, he had known it 7 years before anyone else in that family would need to know it. He hadn't given me a sentimental gift. He had given me a door and told me, gently, that one day I might need to be the one who decided whether it opened or closed. If you're watching this and you've ever been quietly, deliberately underestimated by people who had no idea what you were actually holding, you already understand exactly how I felt the morning. I finally understood what that key meant. Now go back with me to that hotel room, 2 in the morning, the night I left. I didn't know any of this yet. Not really. Not in a way I'd let myself use. I only knew I was done being the wife who smiled through toasts. Within a week, I had filed for divorce. Within 2 weeks, Madame Han had stopped even pretending to be sad about it, telling a mutual acquaintance who made sure the words reached me, that the family was finally free to become what it was always meant to be. I let them believe that for a year. I let them believe I had simply disappeared, gone home to Atlanta with my tail between my legs, another cautionary tale about marrying above your station. I let Woo-jin believe it too, because grief needed somewhere quiet to happen, and I wasn't ready yet to let anyone watch me rebuild. What I actually did was open the drawer I hadn't touched in 7 years, take out that brass key, and drive to Incheon. Pier 6 had been sitting empty for 2 decades, structurally sound but abandoned, exactly the kind of forgotten building nobody in a family obsessed with skyscrapers thinks twice about. I walked through it alone the first day. Dust and pigeons, and 70 years of harbour light coming through broken skylights. And for the first time since I'd left that kitchen, I felt something other than grief. I felt the beginning of an idea. I used every dollar of savings I had built quietly over 15 years. Money Madame Han never knew existed because she had never once asked what I did with the small design consulting fees I'd taken on the side. The kind of work she considered beneath a Gu family wife, and therefore never bothered to notice. I hired an architecture firm, my old firm in Atlanta, and I brought in a partner I trusted completely, a woman named Marisol Fenwick I'd known since graduate school, someone sharp enough to see exactly what Pier 6 could become and loyal enough to help me build it in complete silence. Within a year, Pier 6 had become the headquarters and flagship studio of Winslow Design Group, an architecture and adaptive reuse firm quietly earning a reputation among exactly the kind of investors who read industry journals no one at Gu Group ever bothered to open. I wasn't hiding out of shame. I was building out of clarity, for the first time in 15 years, something that belonged entirely to me. The work itself became its own kind of medicine. There is something particular about stripping a building down to its original brick, finding the century-old beams still sound underneath decades of neglect, that taught me more about my own life than any conversation with a therapist ever could have. Marisol used to say I was more careful with that warehouse than most people are with their own children, and she wasn't wrong. I sounded a section of the original foreman's desk myself, by hand, over 3 straight weekends, refusing to let the contractor's crew touch it, because some part of me needed to prove I could still be gentle with something and have that gentleness returned to me, undamaged, exactly as I'd left it. There were harder nights too, nights Marisol doesn't let me forget even now. She found me once, close to midnight, sitting on the floor of what would eventually become our main studio, surrounded by 15 years of photographs I'd finally allowed myself to go through. She didn't say anything wise. She just sat down on the dusty floor next to me in her work clothes, took half the stack out of my hands, and started sorting through them with me in silence until the sun came up and we were both laughing, exhausted and raw, at a photo of Woo-jin trying and failing to eat spicy tteokbokki on our honeymoon. "You're allowed to miss the good years," she told me that morning, without wanting the bad ones back. I have carried that sentence with me every day since. Marisol used to tease me about it in the early months. "You realize you own the one piece of land that entire merger needs," she said one afternoon, spreading blueprints across the very desk that used to be a shipping foreman's office 70 years earlier. "You could burn that whole deal down with one signature you refused to sign." "I don't want to burn it down," I told her, and I meant it, at least at the time. "I just want to build something they can't take credit for." It didn't stay that simple, though. Nothing ever does, once the people you left behind figure out what you're still holding. 8 months after I filed for divorce, Woo-jin found me, not by accident. Somebody on Yo Holdings' due diligence team had finally traced the ownership of Pier Six, buried under a decade-old filing, back to me, and the news had apparently detonated quietly through 2 boardrooms before it ever reached my door. He came to the studio himself, alone, no driver waiting outside, which told me something had actually shaken him. I hadn't seen him in 8 months. He looked older than 8 months should have made him look, the particular kind of older that comes from losing something and only understanding the size of it afterward. He stood in the doorway of the office that used to be his father's private meeting room, looking at the exposed brick and the salvaged steel beams Marisol and I had spent a year restoring by hand, and he said, quietly, "You did this!" "I did," I said. "You never told me. You never asked what I wanted, Woo-jin, for 15 years. I stopped waiting for you to start." He asked me to sign the parcel over, formally, as part of finalizing the divorce settlement. And when I told him no, not out of spite, simply because it was mine and I intended to keep building on it, he asked me if this was revenge. I told him the truth. I told him it had never been revenge, not for one single day. That revenge would have meant caring enough about his wedding, his merger, his mother's approval, to spend my time destroying it, and I had spent that time building something instead, which was its own kind of answer if he was honest enough to hear it. Then he apologized. Not the performative, half-formed apology he'd offered the night I left, but a real one, the kind that comes from a year of silence finally catching up to a person. He told me he had been a coward in that kitchen. He told me he understood now, watching what I had built alone, exactly what he had let his mother and his own fear talk him out of protecting. He told me he still loved me, and that if there was any version of this where I could forgive him, he would spend the rest of his life earning it back. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't nothing. 15 years doesn't disappear just because someone hurts you. I felt the old pull of him, the boy on the rooftop underneath the man who had let his mother humiliate me at a podium. But I had learned something in those 8 months that I don't think I could have learned any other way. I had learned the difference between hearing an apology and accepting one. "I hear you," I told him. "I believe that you mean it. But hearing you isn't the same as forgiving you, Woo-jin, and forgiving you isn't the same as coming back. If you've ever had to explain to someone that their apology, however sincere, doesn't automatically erase what they cost you, you already know that this is one of the hardest sentences a person can say out loud. Type the word enough in the comments if you've ever had to draw that same line, gently but completely, with someone you used to love. He left that day without the signature he came for. I found out 3 weeks later, through Marisol's contacts in the shipping industry, that his mother had ordered him to proceed with the So-min marriage anyway, on the theory that once the wedding was official, once the alliance was sealed publicly and irreversibly, I would eventually feel enough pressure, social or financial, to sell the parcel and let the whole redevelopment proceed on schedule. Madame Han had underestimated me exactly the way her husband once told me nobody in that family should. She had assumed a woman who quietly endured 15 years of her contempt would go on quietly enduring it forever, even after she was gone. I let the wedding planning continue for 6 months without saying a word. I let Yo Dong-hyun sink deeper and deeper into a redevelopment plan built on a parcel of land he did not, and could not, control. I let the investors, the ones I had spent that year quietly cultivating relationships with through Winslow Design Group, hear through entirely legitimate industry channels exactly how much of the Incheon Harbor project remained unresolved. I said nothing false to anyone. I simply stopped hiding the truth, and let the truth do what truth does when people have spent a long time building on top of a lie. Which brings us back to where I started, to a Saturday afternoon, in a ballroom full of orchids, to a woman in gold walking through the east doors 11 minutes before a ceremony that was never going to happen the way anyone in that room expected. I hadn't come to make a scene. I want you to understand that clearly. I had come because 3 days earlier, Yo Dong-hyun's legal team had finally, formally, reached out to Winslow Design Group requesting an emergency meeting about Pier Six, having discovered what half his board already suspected, that the wedding of his daughter had been scheduled to finalize a merger built on land nobody had secured. I had come to deliver, in person, my answer to that request, and it happened, by design and not by accident. to fall on the one afternoon every relevant party in that entire alliance would already be gathered in the same room. I stood at the front of that aisle, close enough to see Woo-jin's jaw tremble, close enough to watch So-min's composure start to fracture at the edges, and I did not raise my voice, because I had learned, over 15 years married into that family, that the quietest sentence in the room is always the one people remember. "I'm not here to stop a wedding," I said, loud enough to carry, calm enough that every phone in that room had already started recording. "I'm here because your merger has been built for the last year on land I own, and no one asked me. I've come to give you my answer in person, out of respect for how many people's futures apparently depend on it." I turned to Yeo Dong-hyun, seated in the second row, his face going the particular shade of grey that belongs only to powerful men realizing, in real time, in public, that they have been building on sand. "Pier 6 is not for sale," I told him. "It never was. I built something there I'm proud of, and I have no intention of tearing it down to make room for a redevelopment plan that was signed off on before anyone bothered to check who actually held the deed." For a moment, nobody moved. So-min stood frozen in her wedding gown at the top of the aisle, and I watched something shift across her face that I hadn't expected to see. Not triumph, not even anger, but the particular blankness of someone realizing in real time that the ground she'd been standing on was never actually solid. She turned, slowly, to look at her father in the second row, and I understood then that she genuinely hadn't known. That whatever calculation she'd made about Woo-jin and about me, she had made it believing the merger itself was already secure. Some betrayals, it turns out, get built on other betrayals nobody bothers to mention to the people standing closest to them. Woo-jin found his voice before anyone else did. "Anaya," he said, low, urgent, stepping down from the altar. "Let's talk about this privately. Please. We had 15 years of privately." "Woo-jin," I said, still calm, still steady, because I had promised myself in that hotel room a year earlier that I would never again let anyone rush me into a smaller version of the truth. "I think everyone standing here today deserves the same honesty you never gave me." Madame Han's voice cut through the murmuring crowd before he could answer, sharp enough that heads turned toward the front row instead. "This is family business," she said. "You have no place here anymore." I looked at her for a long moment, the woman who had spent 15 years teaching me exactly how much unkindness a person can survive, and I thought, unexpectedly, of her husband by the koi pond, telling me quietly that I was the first honest thing that had happened to that family in years. I wondered if she had ever known he'd said that. I wondered if it would have changed anything if she had. "You're right," I said. "I have no place in this family. I never did, not to you. But I have a very clear place on the deed to the one piece of land your son's entire marriage was quietly built to secure, and that place is mine, whether you approve of me or not." Somewhere near the back of the room, a phone kept recording. I found out later it belonged to a junior analyst from one of Yo Holdings' own investment partners, someone who had no personal stake in the drama unfolding at the altar and every professional reason to document, carefully and completely, exactly how unstable this alliance actually was. That single video reached both companies' boards before the reception dinner would even have started, if there had still been a reception left to have. By the time I finished speaking, half the room already understood what this meant, and the rest understood it within the hour, once the whispering reached the tables where Yo Holdings' own board members sat. A merger that size doesn't survive a public revelation like that. Investors who had already been nervous about the Gu family's stability found their nerves fully justified within the week. Yo Dong-hyun withdrew from the alliance before the following Monday's market opened, unwilling to let his own company's fortunes remain tethered to a family whose chairman's mother had staged a wedding around an asset she didn't actually control. So-min's engagement dissolved within days of her father's withdrawal, not out of heartbreak, from what I later heard, but out of the same cold calculation that had built the whole arrangement in the first place. Once the merger was gone, so was her reason for staying. Gu Group's stock dropped 9% the following week. 2 board members re-signed within the month, citing concerns about leadership stability that were, by then, difficult to argue with. Madame Han, who had spent 15 years deciding I was not suitable, watched her carefully constructed alliance collapse in a single ballroom, in front of every camera she had personally invited, because she had underestimated the one person in that family who had actually been paying attention the whole time. Woo-jin found me 3 weeks later, not at the studio this time, but at Pier 6 itself, standing on the same rooftop where we'd met 15 years earlier, though this rooftop had a finished skylight now, and a small garden Marisol had insisted on planting along the edge. He stood there for a while without saying anything, looking out over the water the way his father used to, hands in his pockets. And for a moment I saw the boy from the unfinished roof again, the one who used to bring me coffee at 6 in the morning because he noticed when I forgot to eat. That boy hadn't entirely disappeared. He had just been buried under 15 years of a family that taught him power mattered more than honesty, until he'd forgotten there was ever a difference. "My mother lost her seat on the board last week," he said eventually. "The other directors voted her off after the merger collapsed. She hasn't spoken to me since." I didn't feel triumph hearing that, which surprised me. I felt something closer to grief, the particular kind you feel for a person who spent their whole life building walls and then discovered, too late, that the walls had also kept her family out. "I'm not telling you that so you'll feel sorry for her," he added quickly. "I'm telling you because I think you're the only person who would understand what it means to lose your place in that family and still somehow have to keep living your life afterward." He didn't ask me to come back. I think, finally, he understood there wasn't a version of an apology large enough to undo what 400 witnesses and a collapsed merger had already made permanent. He asked me, instead, what I was going to build next. I told him the truth. I told him I didn't know yet, and that for the first time in 15 years, not knowing didn't frighten me. I told him I was proud of the marriage we'd had in its good years, and that I would carry those years with me the way you carry anything true, without needing them to have lasted forever to have mattered. "My father was right about you," he said, before he left. "He told me once that you were the first honest thing that had happened to this family in a long time. I didn't understand what he meant until I watched you walk out of that ballroom and realized you'd been holding the truth the entire time, and none of us ever thought to ask." I watched him walk back down to his car, the boy from the rooftop grown into a man who had finally run out of silence to hide behind. And I stood there a while longer in the light coming through that restored skylight, in a building that had once been the beginning of everything his family had, and was now, finally, entirely, the beginning of everything mine. If you've ever had to build your whole life over again in complete silence, without applause, without anyone watching, just to prove to yourself that you still could, I hope you know exactly how far that kind of quiet can carry you. Comment, "I built mine too" below, because I think there are more of us out here rebuilding in silence than any of us realize, and I would love to know your story. I still run Winslow Design Group out of Pier 6. Marisol is a full partner now, and we've since restored 2 more buildings along that same stretch of Incheon Harbour. Buildings nobody else thought were worth saving, which feels, most days, like exactly the point. I heard, through people who still move in those circles, that Woo-jin stepped back from day-to-day leadership of Goo Group about a year later, that Madame Han's influence over the company's direction has never fully recovered, that neither of them speak of that Saturday afternoon if they can help it. I don't think about it with anger anymore, if that's what you're waiting to hear. I think about it. When I think about it at all, the way you think about whether you survived a long time ago. It happened. It was real. It changed the shape of everything that came after it. But I am not standing in that storm anymore. I am standing in a building with my name on the deed, in a life I built with my own hands after 15 years of believing I had to shrink myself to be loved. Some evenings, closing up the studio after Marisol has already gone home, I climb up to the rooftop garden we built along the edge of Pier 6, the one with the skylight and the small, stubborn row of hydrangeas that refuse to die no matter how badly I neglect them, and I watch the same stretch of harbour Woo-jin and I used to watch together at 23 years old. The water hasn't changed. The light still turns gold over it in exactly the same way it did the summer we met. I have, though. I'm not the woman who sat quietly through toasts anymore, the one who mistook endurance for love and silence for peace. I'm the woman who finally understood that being chosen isn't worth much if you have to disappear a little more of yourself every year to keep being chosen. If there's one thing I'd want you to carry away from all of this, it's that the version of you who stays quiet to keep the peace is not the same as the version of you who finally decides her own peace matters more. It took me 15 years and one gold dress to learn the difference. I hope it takes you far less time than that. He didn't know what he had. All those years I stayed quiet. All those years I let a family decide I was lovely but not suitable. He didn't know what I was capable of building, or what I was already quietly holding, right up until the moment I walked through the east doors of a ballroom he thought belonged entirely to him. He didn't know. Now he does.